Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's episode of the Pete Wargent Property Pod. I'm extra thrilled this week to have a super special guest, Mr. Alan Kohler. Now, Alan, I usually go through a bio. I could probably use the entire 30 minutes reading out your biography, but I'll try and do an abridged version and you can tell me where I get it wrong. So, Huntingdale High School and Victoria University, you've been a financial journo for over 45 years, I believe. Started with a cadetship at the Australian, a little bit of time with the legendary NT News up in Darwin until the fearsome Cyclone Tracy flattened the house you were living in, which I think was 1974. And as a former resident of Darwin, I know how terrifying that must have been. A bit of time in Europe as well with your future wife at the Exeter Express, another nice part of the world, and then returning to Australia to be a columnist with The Age in 1978. So also a columnist with the Fin Review and the editor from 1985 to 1988, I think I'm right in saying, and then from 1992, editor of The Age for over 20 years. Also, a couple of business ventures. You're founder of the Eureka Report, Business Spectator, which I think is now part of News Corp. And I'm sure there's some other stuff I've missed out along the way. And of course, most people would know you as well from the ABC News, with all your graphs and charts. So what have I missed there? I think there was some time in stockbroking.
I wasn't editor of the Age for 20 years. I was editor of the Age for 3 years, 92 to 95. And then that's when I joined the ABC at 95.
I'll shoot the researcher, which is actually myself. So apologies for that. And a bit of time in Western Australia as well, I think, somewhere along the line.
I spent a couple of years in Perth.
Yes, another super place to be. So, Alan, I wanted to get you on because we're into a different landscape now and a period of rising inflation, and in some parts of the world, very high inflation. I figured I need some guests who have been around the traps for more than a year or two to give us some special insights. But before we kick into that, give us a bit of an idea of your background and how did you even get into the idea of journalism and then business journalism in the first place?
I didn't do very well at school apart from in English, so I thought I'd better be a journalist because I could write. And that was kind of the main thing. It was only later that I discovered an affinity for mathematics and finance issues. I joined the Australian at the age of 18 as a cadet, as you pointed out. I started as a copy boy, actually. Copy boys in those days, you made the coffee and did the dry cleaning for the journalists and the filing. So I did that for a while and then got a cadetship, and it just happened that it was on the finance section of the Australian. And so I kind of started in finance journalism by accident and stayed there because I enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. Spent my cadetship mostly at the stock exchange, which in those days was not electronic. It was open outcry with all the brokers on the floor of the exchange, and there was a press gallery above it. It was a bit like the Parliament, I guess. You had a press gallery and the journalists watched the brokers do their thing, and the chalkies on the board writing up the prices with their pieces of chalk, and the brokers calling out the prices down below. So that was kind of my initiation into finance.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually incredible to think how much has changed over that kind of a time period. And this might be an impossible question on that basis, but do you have any particular highlights or lowlights of that long period, all those decades in journalism?
Well, when I started at the Australian, it was the peak of the Poseidon boom. And I think Poseidon shares at that point were $250. And so I just joined in time for the crash. After that, the boom had kind of happened already. And I joined. Journalists and brokers were all getting around in Rolls Royces, having made their fortunes from various stocks that had taken off, and having a lovely time, and then the crash happened. Luckily, I mean, I was too poor at that point to buy any shares, so I didn't lose any money because I didn't buy any shares. But I was able to get an initiation into the ways of markets and how they crash fairly early on. So I kind of learned some lessons then about how markets behave. I suppose that was a highlight.
Yes, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's we've seen a couple of booms and a couple of recessions, I guess, over all those years, and I suppose the business cycle will continue to do what it does. I guess specifically as it relates to journalism, that industry or sector has changed an awful lot, probably almost an accelerating change, which you've been a big part of as well, I guess, with the businesses you've founded. What would you say to a youngster starting out today, considering a career in journalism? Because clearly it's not the same landscape as it used to be, but I guess you could argue that maybe the job security was never that great. But do you have any sort of tips? I guess flexibility would be important, and maybe finding some coaches or mentors to help you along the journey. But any guidance there?
My son wanted to be a journalist, and I tried to persuade him not to be, because I thought it was not a very secure business these days for young people. There are not many jobs going in journalism, not as many as there used to be. But he went ahead and did it anyway, and he's doing fine. So I suppose I've learnt from that it is possible to have a career in journalism still. It isn't, if you really want to be a journalist and you've got some talent, you can get somewhere, no doubt about it. I mean, I think The Age took on half a dozen cadets the other day. They had a couple of hundred applicants, I think. But, so look, it's hard. There's no doubt about it. It's a difficult game to be in. And also, it's hard to make enough in journalism these days to bring up a family. I think a lot of people sort of, as they get to the point when they need just to buy a house, have a mortgage, have children, they need to go and do something else to make more money. I think that's true. Very few people make enough to stay a journalist while they have a family.
Yes, and we'll come straight on to that related point actually on the housing market. I know Chris. I bump into him around the traps a little bit, and I've been on his show, and he's obviously a natural in terms of presenting and in front of the camera. And I always feel underdressed when I go on his show because he's always got the smart suits on. But he'll have a very good career, no doubt, having so much natural talent. You mentioned journalists getting onto the property ladder. This is a question I usually throw at people, but when did you buy your first property? Was that back in Victoria, or did you buy elsewhere?
We rented in England when we were over there. We got married in England, rented obviously there. We didn't buy anything in England. We came back and rented here first, then bought a place in North Fitzroy, Melbourne in 1978. So about a year after we got back. A fixer-upper in North Fitzroy. We've fixed it up, and that got us on the property ladder.
Yeah, it's been a heck of a run for prices in Melbourne. It's been one of the, I suppose, most consistently high-performing property markets in the country. And I guess until 2 years ago, everybody seemed to be moving to Melbourne as well. And there's been a big shift through the COVID pandemic. So this is the topic I really wanted to tap your brains on. Australia in one of the early adopters in inflation targeting in the early 1990s. And we did have a period of relatively high inflation through the mining boom years. And actually, in global terms, we had quite high interest rates there up until the financial crisis. But then ever since that time, the economy has been characterised by ever falling interest rates, which has been a positive for the housing market, certainly in terms of prices, and relatively low inflation. In fact, we've been under the inflation target for 6 or 7 years, I think I'm right in saying, on the core measures. Now, suddenly, we've got these overlapping supply shocks. So the COVID shutdowns have impacted supply chains, and then we've had the dramatic tensions in the Ukraine, and also potentially further geopolitical tensions. And now suddenly we're all talking about high inflation and how higher interest rates are going to go and how far might they rise, what kind of impacts they're going to have on households. You would have had some first-hand experience of Australia through the highest inflation years in recent memory. How do you see things playing out? Do you think this might be a temporary issue, or does rising inflation start to feed into the expectations of even more inflation?
I think we need to regard the period of 0.1% cash rate on the RBA as an aberration. That was temporary. I mean, it was designed to deal with the pandemic and interest rates. But as you point out, interest rates have been coming down over the decades, and inflation have been coming down more or less since 1980. There was a big spike in interest rates in 1989 when there was a blowout in wages and the current account deficit blew out. And that's when we had the recession we had to have, according to Paul Keating. And we'd just bought a house in 1988. We'd moved back from Sydney, where I was running the Financial Review. We moved back to Melbourne, bought a house, took out a mortgage, then was hit with 17% interest rates. So that was really difficult time, for everybody. At that time, a lot of people lost their job. Happily, I didn't lose my job. So there was the recession of 1991. The interest rate that resulted from that caused that recession was horrendous. And I think it kind of is certainly branded in my memory. So I kind of really saw what monetary policy can do to people's lives and to the economy generally. Obviously, since then, the interest rates have been coming down, and we got down. Now we're as low as the cash rate at 0.1%. And as you say, everyone's now talking inflation. Inflation in Australia is not really going anywhere near what it is in the US. In the United States, inflation is back to 7.5%, and they've already put up their cash rate, or the central bank interest rate, by 0.25% last week. And so that's kind of now beginning. The kind of the tightening of monetary policy around the world has begun. And so now the question in Australia is two questions. One is, first, when will the first rate hike happen? And the more important question is, how high will rates go in Australia? My view is that the interest rates here will go nowhere near as high as they have in the past. I think the market expectation is that rates will get to the cash rate will get to 1.5%, maybe 2% at the most. And I think that sounds about right. I mean, and we can get into the reasons for that. The main reason being that everyone's borrowed so much. I mean, there's been with interest rates so low, there's been a massive amount of borrowing.
I was asked a similar question a month or two ago, and I guess probably for the same reasons came up with the same number. It feels like, yes, the cash rate could go higher. In fact, it will go higher. Might get to 1.5%, maybe 2% at a push. But I guess, as you said, the dynamic is quite different now. You mentioned the high interest rate period in the early 90s. Well, obviously, you grew up in Europe, but I can remember sitting around the dinner table on the day when the Bank of England base rate went from 10 to 12% in one day. And the government was talking about 15% by the end of the year. And I remember my parents were, pretty much mortified. They were saying we're going to have to stop spending money. There's going to be a lot of unemployment. Job security was out the window. Real first-hand impacts on households and families. Now, I guess the mentality then, though, was you took out a loan for a place to live, and then you paid it off as quickly as you could. But all those years of lower mortgage rates, the fear of household debt has gone away. And in fact, a lot of households have really leveraged up, and it sort of feeds on itself. It's pretty hard now for interest rates to go up without having an immediate impact on the economy. And therefore, maybe 1%, 1.5%, 2% is going to have quite a big impact on people, and therefore they might have a cooling effect, maybe quicker than what we were used to back then. I suppose the other really maybe unprecedented thing that's been going on, I guess, for the past 2 years has been almost a regional renaissance. And we've seen this kind of race for space as people have, I guess, down your way, they've moved out to places like Geelong or Mornington Peninsula or Bendigo and Ballarat. And I saw the ABS put out some figures this week that had showed during the third quarter of 2021, there's a huge shift of people moving largely from New South Wales, but also from Victoria up to southeast Queensland, I guess, to escape restrictions and to get more space and affordability. I suppose of all the cities in Australia, Melbourne has felt the real impacts of this firsthand. Reportedly, a lot of shops up for lease, people not wanting to start businesses because of the risk. I guess be interested to get your thoughts, sort of first-hand thoughts, because I haven't been to Melbourne for a few years. What are you seeing down there? Do you think any of this will reverse? Do you think people will go back to the big cities, back into the office? I guess there seems to be a bit of a tension or tug of war at the moment between employers and employees about working from home. What do you see happening down there?
Well, driving around Melbourne has got back to being just as difficult as it was in the past. So the traffic is terrible. So there's no sign of population declining on the roads, that's for sure. As far as working from home goes, there's clearly going to be a hybrid economy of people working more from home. People won't be, it seems to me, a lot of people, most people perhaps, won't be going into the office Monday to Friday, 9 o'clock Monday morning, home at 5 o'clock Friday, that sort of thing. I think that there's going to be much more of partial working from home and partial in the office. And it's hard to know exactly how that's going to work out, but it's definitely going to be of that sort, it seems to me. Some people are working from home all the time who can, and that's fine. And obviously some people work in the office all the time because they have to. But, I think that the norm is going to be partial. And so therefore people are finding, I think, the reporting is that people are inclined to have a long commute if it's only for a couple of days a week, 2 or 3 days a week. They're inclined that they think, okay, I can commute for an hour and a half if it's not every day. And so people are, I think, more inclined to move further out of the city to have a bigger house, more land, perhaps a better lifestyle, spend less money on a house and commute 2 or 3 days a week. I think we're seeing a fair bit of that.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I've been doing a bit of the same myself. Work from home most days. I go into the office some days, but it's generally the office has been pretty quiet. And it seems to be a bit of a reluctance to get back into the office. And I wonder whether people have been staying off public transport and that's been exacerbating the road congestion. You mentioned the population growth or the density in Melbourne, which I think of all the cities pre-COVID was seeing the highest rate of capital city immigration, population growth. And it seems to be a potentially contentious subject at the moment. Obviously, it's an election year, coalition government looking pretty long in the tooth and probably due for a change. What do you think the governments of the future will do about immigration settings? Because, pre-COVID, we were running population growth at about 1.5%, which I suppose implies population growth of around 375,000 per annum, largely made up of immigration as well as the natural growth in the population. Do you think we'll go back towards a similar immigration setting, or do you think there's going to be maybe a reset because we've now had effectively 2 years of no immigration?
I think it depends largely on who wins the election, because the coalition is more inclined to have high levels of immigration than the Labor Party for labour relations or industrial relations purposes. The coalition doubled Australia's immigration in 2006 from roughly 100,000 a year to 200,000 a year at the time, and it was, in my view, largely an industrial strategy designed to suppress wages and to help the project that they had of crushing the unions. And it worked. I mean, wages growth has been extremely sluggish ever since then, and the unions have got virtually no power. So I think it was a very effective strategy to use immigration in that way. And I think the coalition has always been very strong on borders and refugees and, stop the boats, that sort of thing. And I think that was partly designed to support, or at least disguise, the high level of immigration. Obviously, that all came to an end with the pandemic. The COVID immigration stopped, and there's now a reset to take place, and the question is, if the coalition wins, will they go back to high levels of immigration as before? I suspect not. I think the Labor Party definitely won't, but because it's now become basically conventional wisdom among the economic world that the biggest problem for the Australian economy is slow wages growth. The high levels of immigration has contributed to the slow wages growth, which is now seen as the biggest problem. So I think, there's going to be a lot of economic pressure from various quarters, including the Reserve Bank, on the coalition and the Labor Party not to go back to very, very high levels of immigration. So I think we'll return to, 100,000, 150,000 a year people, and maybe 1% population growth rather than 1.5%.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
One of the things that made me think inflation would be temporary, because I guess all of those factors like outsourcing, people using contractors in Asia, or more affordable markets as the global labour supplies increase. I mean, those trends haven't gone away, but I guess the supply shocks have kept on coming, and that has really driven inflation, probably more so than the size of the demand in the economy. But the longer inflation goes on globally, the more it seems to be an issue that might stick around. Obviously, you mentioned election year. Last time around, May 2019, housing market policies seemed to be front and centre. We had negative gearing reform on the table. We had capital gains tax discount, also franking credits, and changes to the dividend imputation rules, which was particularly unpopular in this part of the world and southeast Queensland. But it seems this time around, housing policies, at least pre-election, aren't likely to feature as much. I think Labor's got some announcements around a social housing fund and the creation of affordable rentals and properties for key workers and so on, but maybe not such a big election issue in 2022, you think?
Oh, definitely not. Obviously, Labor's certainly not going to mention it. They were burnt last time. They won't bring it up. And I mean, the question is, I guess, whether they'll do it, or they'll just shut up about it and then do it. Maybe. I think it's more likely to be something like the GST situation, when John Howard promised, never to do it. 1996 election, Howard promised not to do GST and said we're never going to do it, and then, but he introduced it as policy in the following election, which he won. And so I think if there's going to be a housing policy election, it'll be the one after this one. Assuming Labor wins. If Labor wins, then I think that there's a fair chance they'll go to the next election with some housing policies, negative gearing, capital gains tax among them. I think there's a fair case to do something about that. Because those things clearly distort the housing market and asset markets in general. So I think that there's a case for doing something about it, perhaps winding back negative gearing in some way. And it was done in New Zealand. I think they'll probably do it here, but they'll take it as a policy to the election so they get a mandate.
Arguably, the time to make changes to those rules is when interest rates are low, because I guess the impact on the market would be somewhat less. I mean, I suppose the savings might be less correspondingly. But we saw in United Kingdom, the budget actually changed the deductibility rules on interest for landlords, particularly impacted the higher rate taxpayers. But the world kept turning. People found ways to still be landlords if that's what they want to do. The housing market didn't implode. Rental markets largely kept on working as they should. So, maybe it's something that will come back onto the table, as you said, maybe once there's been a change of government, once the incumbent maybe might get another look. Now, Alan, I know that you mentioned you've got kids, as do I, and I sort of an obliquely related story. A few years ago, when everybody was talking about Brisbane apartments being the Australia's version of subprime, and you could buy them very cheap, I picked up a unit in a suburb called New Farm, and part of my thinking was, well, look, even if the investment returns aren't amazing. Maybe if my kids go to UQ sometime in the future, it might be something they could use, or maybe even a foothold onto the housing ladder. And it got me thinking that this is kind of a change in mindset, really, for intergenerational opportunities and wealth. Certainly, my parents never really thought about helping their kids onto the ladder because it just wasn't considered, it's supposed to be such a critical issue in those days. You could get 100% mortgages, and most people found their way onto the ladder once they had full-time employment. Obviously, it's very difficult for first home buyers today. Do you have any thoughts on, is it still a good idea to invest in real estate, just in general terms, not specific advice? I know a lot of young people tend to rent where they live, buy an investment property, and then have their shares in super. Do you think a combination of the two might be best? Or any thoughts on the challenges facing the younger generation? Because I think clearly that cohort has become quite disillusioned with the coalition, and there's going to be some challenges in that area.
The great benefit of investing in real estate, residential real estate, is you can borrow 80% of the value, which you can't do with shares. So, and also, it's nice to own a house. You can walk through it and feel it and look at it. It's kind of a good thing to own as an investment. But the most advantageous thing is to be able to borrow so much. You can borrow sometimes 90%, depending on the bank, but mostly 80% of the value, and you can't do that with shares. But the negative about owning a property is that it's illiquid. It's hard to sell. I'm in the process of selling an investment property at the moment, and it's it's a pain in the neck. You've got to fix it up. You've got to you've got all these inspections over a month or so, and then you've got to negotiate and have the auction. And crikey, it's an absolute nightmare. And you've got to pay the estate agent a ridiculous amount of money. So, look, there are negatives about investing in property, and there are positives. The shares, I've got a share portfolio, and if I want to buy a share or sell it, I just go click and it's done. It's fantastic, and the liquidity is fantastic, and you get it sold on the day. So you need to take those things into account. If you're thinking about investing in property, I think the performance tends to be roughly the same over the long term of residential real estate and the share market. You can obviously do better with residential real estate because you can borrow more, so you invest less for the same amount of investment. But this is what your bread and butter, Pete. You probably tell clients that all the time, and it's as I say, there are pluses and minuses.
Yes, I suppose you could make the case that historically, rising inflation tends to get capitalised into land values, and I guess if you're taking a long-term view, the performance has been pretty good. I suppose the flip side to that, though, is that if you're borrowing today, you do need to factor in that the cash rate is not going to stay at 0.1%, 10 basis points. You have to factor in a buffer, because at some point along the journey, maybe sooner rather than later, you're going to see mortgage rates higher, and you need to factor that in. My sort of final or closing questions for you, Alan. I guess we've seen you over the years on ABC News with your amazing graphs and charts, and I remember you and Stephen Kukulis even had a book out on your world in charts, which was a great read. I find it very hard to somehow imagine you in retirement. You always seem to be on the go, always busy, on the news all the time, got your other business ventures going. So I guess my twin questions are you still learning after more than 45 years in the industry? And also, what might the end game look like for you? Can you see yourself giving it all away, or are you just going to keep on going?
Well, I turn 70 next month, and I've got no intentions of retiring. Everyone keeps asking me, when are you going to retire? And I say, I'm not going to. What am I going to do? I don't really want to do anything else. I enjoy what I'm doing. I'm learning all the time. One of my favourite things, I do a bunch of different things apart from go on the TV. I write for the New Daily, and I'm editor of the Eureka Report, which I started in 2005. I don't own it anymore, but I'm still the editor of it, and I write for that. But one of the favourite things I do is interview people for Eureka Report and interview CEOs. So this morning I interviewed the CEO of a medicinal cannabis company, and spent half an hour talking to him about his business, and I learned so much about medicinal cannabis and what's going on in that business. And so every day I interview a different CEO of a different business, and it's great. I just love it. I wouldn't be dead for quids.
Yeah, I can't remember who said if you enjoy what you do or if you follow your passion, then you'll never work a day in your life. I'm now thinking maybe I should have got into medicinal cannabis, but maybe that's a conversation for another day. Alan, you kind of mentioned a couple of places where people can track you down, and obviously we'll put some links in the show notes. But where should people go if they want to find out more about your latest books, where they can see you on the news, read you on the New Daily? Where's the best place to go for more?
The New Daily, obviously I do 2 columns a week for the New Daily, Monday and Thursday. One of the things I do with Eureka Report is a podcast called The Money Cafe, in which I alternate between talking to Stephen Mayne and James Thompson. We answer people's questions about finance and property or whatever else they've got in mind. It's reasonably popular. Might even be almost as popular as your podcast, Pete. It's going okay. So you can look up the Money Cafe. Eureka Report is a subscription newsletter. Money Cafe is free, but Eureka Report is $330 a year. And New Daily is free, and the ABC is free. And I'm on the ABC every day. And I occasionally do something for 7:30 on the ABC as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alan. It's genuinely a privilege to be able to interview you and tap into all those years of insights. And obviously, you're a legend in Australian business journalism and journalism more broadly. So thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully, we'll cross paths in Melbourne sometime in the next millennium, if I'm ever allowed back in.
Look me up if you get here, Pete. Happy to have a coffee with you sometime.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, Alan, and we look forward to chatting in due course.
My pleasure. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.